Now I think we can all agree the WWE Network is onto an absolute winner with Stone Cold Steve Austin's Broken Skull session. So far, they have been absolutely fantastic. He's had sit-downs with The Undertaker, Goldberg and Kane prior to this one he's just done with The Big Show, and each one of them seem to they find a nice way of opening up with Stone Cold that maybe we haven't seen from some of them before. I mean, Undertaker, especially a man who protected kayfabe for so long, he just seems to just unbutton them like a shirt and off they go. Oh, that sounds a bit creepy, doesn't it? And this podcast was no different with The Big Show, of course. He's been in the company for so very long. He and Austin have travelled up and down the roads for thousands upon thousands of miles, obviously as rivals throughout the company history. But it's fair to say we haven't really had much from The Big Show in terms of a deep dive on everything in his career. And to be fair, the man has done some very interesting stuff while in WWE. The camaraderie and the chemistry between these two was immediate to see. You can tell they've got some stories between them, but also not afraid to share a few that maybe they haven't heard between the two. Stone Cold, ever the great interviewer, and of course never scared to really needle something when he thinks that someone might be trying to get off track. Seemed to get Big Show in the right kind of mood, really opened up here on this podcast, and as always, a great interview. So let's stop waffling on about it and let me, Adam Nicholas, tell you 10 things we learned from Big Show on Stone Cold's Broken Skull Sessions podcast. Number 10, why he couldn't afford his first wrestling show. Back in 1984, a 12-year-old Big Show, imagine that, just little Big Show, oh, bless him, little Big Show, what a guy. He was desperate to go and see the next NWA show that was coming into his hometown of South Carolina. They were the big name in town and he wanted to go and see them, so he saved up all his pennies and did a load of little tasks like mowing people's lawns, he tells us about on the podcast, do anything he possibly could just to get some money to go and see the show. So he'd saved up enough money to go and buy himself a ticket for this show. He was excited, he could not wait, but then disaster struck because the NWA upped their prices up by doubling the ticket costs. Why? Because who was in town? Only the bloody Four Horsemen, wasn't it? They were the biggest and baddest heels in the territory, and NWA knew that people would pay through the teeth just to get a chance to see them on this run and watch them get beat up. So unfortunately, a little mini show didn't get to go and see the show, but he did come up with a bit of a solution. He actually stood on a bike outside of the arena just so he could get a peek and see some of his idols coming down to the ring for their entrances. Someone he was most interested, he said, was Arn Anderson, who to him is the truest tough guy in the business. Number 9, the only guy he'd do the workers handshake with. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, simply put, the workers handshake is a sort of time-honored tradition amongst wrestlers within the industry, whereby it's a way of letting their fellow wrestlers know how safe they're going to be within the ropes. For example, if you've got a bit of a loose limp handshake, people maybe think that you're not exactly tight between the ropes. But if you've got a firm, strong handshake and you basically rip someone's arm off when you shake the hand, apparently that means they're going to be safer to work with. Big Show always thought that was stupid, and I'll be honest, me too. But Show said despite the fact that he did find the whole thing stupid, there was only one man who he would actually use a working handshake on, and by this I mean the looser type of working handshake, and that was Mean Gene Okerlund, who apparently during his time in WCW was one of the only people who was actually nice to Show, because let's be honest, he was in there as the giant. A lot of people automatically didn't like him because he was big and he was getting an instant push, but apparently Mean Gene Okerlund took care of the Big Show. He said he would always take great care when shaking the hand of Mean Gene Okerlund, just to show some respect to the guy for everything that he'd done for him up to that point in his career. And let's be honest, imagine if he actually did give him a proper firm handshake, he would have ripped his arm off. That's my limbs, pal. Number 8, his super basic WCW audition tape. When the Big Show made his debut in WCW back in 1995 as The Giant, he was being billed as Andre the Giant's son of all things, so no pressure there then, which immediately meant he had to go all the way to the top of the card because he was being pushed as such. Christ, can you imagine that? Now, Big Show was probably always going to turn some heads with his impressive physical size, but apparently his audition tape wasn't exactly anything too strenuous for him, shall we say. Eric Bischoff got him to send a tape in, and now normally you'd imagine it would be, you know, shots of him taking big bumps, or shots of him doing moves, or maybe putting some people in some holes to show he knew the technical side of wrestling. Apparently not. Apparently it was just Big Show running the ropes for 3 minutes. Can you imagine? Just, I don't know. But despite all of this, Bischoff hired him off the back of that tape anyway because, well, let's be honest, he's not going to pass on someone like the Big Show. If you could get, back in the 90s, if you could get someone of that size and stature to be on your brand, it was a done deal. It was a spectacle. Look, this guy is massive. You're not going to see him anywhere else. And let's be honest, they didn't sign him. WWE would have. Number 7, Randy Savage told him, always let Hogan pay. Now, Shaw said that one of his biggest fears was being seen as a freeloader within the company, and when he was out in WCW starting off, he really didn't want to be looking like he was just taking the whole ride for granted and everybody just do everything for him because he's the Big Show and he's at the top of the card or whatever. So what he was doing was constantly offering to pay his way, split bills, etc, etc. As you do. That went directly against advice given to him by Macho Man Randy Savage, who said whenever you are out with the company's top earner, who of course was Hulk Hogan, you can always let him pay and you can save your money and put it towards something else. Now, for all of his many faults, Big Terry's, and I'm sure he's got quite a few, by all accounts, he was very happy to do this because that's what you do when you're the top earner, and it sets a good example, I guess, with all the boys across the floor. I mean, let's be honest, if he's making so much more money than they are, it's probably a tiny gesture to him. So really, some sage advice from the Macho Man Randy Savage, who said he should save that money, but also suggested the Big Show should try and save his body for the future because he was so keen to do things like drop kicks and go to the top rope and take some aerial maneuvers, but at the end of the day, he's a giant, and if he wanted to prolong his career, Savage suggested maybe just don't do that stuff. Number 6, his favourite WWE run was 2011 to 2014. During a 3-year stint between 2011 and 2014, Big Show would win 2 World Heavyweight Championships and 1 Intercontinental Championship. For all of the things he's been involved with, the early years in WCW, the WWF Attitude Era and his debut, he says this time period is the thing he looks back most fondly on. Shaw said that he felt like this was the time of his career where he really saw everything began to click into place. Up until that point, he said he'd often asked himself aloud while looking in the mirror that how was he meant to make this work? He just couldn't figure it all out, and he wanted to try and become better at what he did. And it wasn't up until that point, he said, that he finally started to feel like he was getting it right. During that period, he got to work with the likes of Daniel Bryan, Mark Henry and John Cena, and that alone motivated him to want to be better. And if you look back at that point, really, Big Show's never probably been more creative and more interesting than he actually was. Pre-2011 though, he said he kind of just didn't feel comfortable in his own skin, which I guess would make sense and why he did so many sort of comedy spots and felt like a guy who was just happy to be there. But for this 3-year stint, he was at the top of his game. Number 5, Shaw detested JR's weight loss chat. When John Laurinaitis replaced Jim Ross as WWE Head of Talent Relations, Big Show, it's fair to say, was a big fan. Shaw said he absolutely hated having conversations with Jim Ross, regular conversations they are, about his weight. He was always telling him you need to be losing a bit of weight, and Big Show didn't necessarily agree with the idea that he should be this trimmed down 400-pound, I say 400-pound trimmed down, but you know what I mean, for Big Show's frame, trimmed down, shredded version of himself. He said that John Laurinaitis didn't badger him the same way about this, and as a result, he felt like his relationship with Vince McMahon actually improved because McMahon wasn't constantly being told, this guy needs to lose some weight, which sounds like a plus for him. What he did acknowledge though was that at the time, maybe he just couldn't see the fact, but Jim Ross was actually trying to help him because Ross had seen what had happened to Andre the Giant in his later years and how much being such a big guy had affected him and his body and his sort of quality of life as he got on, and didn't want the same thing to happen to Shaw. JR felt that if he did get down to that optimum weight level, he could be a real contributor for the brand. And despite all of this, while it might not have been Big Show's favourite thing to hear, it sounds like Jim Ross was kind of just looking out for him. Number 4, he blasted Braun Strowman. Now, we always hear tales backstage of the veterans of the sport like Big Show, The Undertaker, all staring back and watching people's matches from the modern era and critiquing them and giving them advice on how to better themselves in the ring. Now, obviously, Shaw has the benefit of hindsight here, but he said he was regularly trying to bump for other guys when he was early on in his career because he felt like he wanted to be one of the boys and he wanted to do his part. But if anything, that kind of damaged his aura a little bit, which is why when Braun Strowman was having a match with Sami Zayn and he took a clothesline from Zayn and actually went down and bumped for him, Big Show was waiting for him behind the curtain after the match. He wasn't furious, but he was suggesting to Strowman that he needed to try and maintain that aura. He shouldn't be taking clotheslines from someone like Sami Zayn, who, despite all of this, Shaw says he's got a ton of respect for, but he needs to keep that aura of being this big, nasty heel, and dropping on his back from a clothesline from Sami Zayn, it's not the way to do it. Much like Jim Ross was with his weight, Big Show said he was just looking out for Braun Strowman and wanted him to be the best he possibly could be, and if that meant learning from his mistakes, all the better for it. Number 3, he thinks WWE's culture needs to change. Now, we've all kind of seen the culture of video games in WWE that's started to come along. Obviously, not to mention Up, Up, Down, Down specifically, and Xavier Woods' fantastic YouTube channel, but that seems to have brought with it a bunch of superstars, guys and gals in the back, who go and play video games either before shows or after shows. And while I'm sure this is probably a really good way to pass the time, to be honest, and actually make some content outside of it, ooh, we love that content, it's something that the Big Show, well, on this particular occasion, isn't a big fan of. He suggested that wrestlers should be more focused on the matches they're about to have and trying to improve themselves both in and out of the ring at any time when they're at work, technically in WWE. Now again, this seems like Big Show's way of trying to help the current crop. He might not have an exact problem with the gaming side of things. I'm sure he's not that bothered about it. I think he's just thinking perhaps there's probably more things could be being done than sort of slacking off and playing video games. And let's be honest, he's probably got a point. Now I should point out, I don't think this is a Big Show hating on everybody kind of deal. This is him actually, again, trying to offer some advice in terms of why not use that time to maybe better yourself. And all these guys and gals who might be floating around the middle could possibly use that time to get the edge on their competition. Don't know, just spitballing here, but let's be honest, it's hard enough doing what they do, so passing the time like that doesn't feel like a bad thing. And compare that to what used to go on in his era, maybe it was a little bit better actually, the old video games, instead of partying and doing God knows what else. Number 2, he'd purposefully avoid The Undertaker after matches. Now, as we've already mentioned here, Big Show wasn't exactly the most self-confident person in the company before his brilliant stint those 3 years between 2011 and 2014, and this was particularly the case back in 1999. A few months after his debut, he was paired with The Undertaker in an attempt to kind of mould him into something bigger and better than he was currently being, because The Undertaker was the vet, and if anybody could get something great out of him, that was the guy. But it didn't quite work out that way, and if anything, he actually ended up terrifying the guy, because he said after every match he had, The Undertaker would chew him out so much and so frequently that it just started to get to the point where he couldn't handle it anymore. And Big Show would often, he told Austin, try and hide backstage before having to speak with The Undertaker. 1, just to kind of get his breath back after matches for 5 seconds, but 2, he said he needed to mentally prepare himself to kind of take on The Undertaker's feedback. Doesn't sound great, really. In fact, he said he was berated so much for his performances at times and given so many contrasting views and opinions from the likes of The Undertaker, Vince McMahon and Pat Patterson, to name a few, that it all just became a bit too much for him to handle, and genuinely said he thought about driving his car off a bridge at one point just to kind of make it all stop. That is absolutely terrifying, man. And number 1, why his WrestleMania match with Austin was canned. Well, you've already got the 2 guys in the room, haven't you? Stone Cold on one side, Big Show on the other. We might as well talk about the elephant in the room. When the Big Show debuted at St. Valentine's Day Massacre back in 1999, he was supposed to go from that moment where he chucked Austin out the cage and helped him win the match to eventually have a big WrestleMania payoff against the Rattlesnake. They wanted to slowly build up a match between Austin and the Big Show and have it happen at WrestleMania 2000, but very quickly, those plans disappeared. On the 22nd of March 1999 episode of Monday Night Raw, the Big Show was beaten by Stone Cold Steve Austin rather succinctly, I might add, and that was the end of that. And he said himself that he wasn't sure he was the right time or the right place to have that match with Austin at WrestleMania. He said he was just a guy who was happy to be in the company, and that was not something Vince McMahon was interested in. Vince wanted a guy who was going to rip people's heads off and challenge the big stars and get bigger performances out of them and immediately just go to the top of his card. Big Show didn't exactly offer that when he first came in, and Vince McMahon lost interest almost immediately. Show said that Vince had mentally moved on from the whole thing after that, and it just seemed like he was completely adrift, and it would be a long time before he'd get back in that part of Vince McMahon's mind, which really goes to show you just how quickly Vince McMahon can sour on a talent when they're not doing the thing he wants them to do. So there you have it, that's it. Those are 10 things we learned about the Big Show on Stone Cold Steve Austin's Broken Skull Sessions podcast. Try saying that when you're drunk. Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. Don't forget to like and share. Hit the old subscribe button if you haven't already. You can find the article for this on whatculture.com/WWE. You can also find What Culture on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE. If you want to give me a follow on Twitter as well, you can find me at It's Adam Nicholas, or you might just want some more videos, and if you do, we've got some over here for you. I've been Adam Nicholas. This has been What Culture Wrestling. I'll see you next time.